joint study conducted alongside the Nigerian Capital Markets Solicitors Association. I was with a team from the UK Law Society. Elizabeth was the co-author of the paper, which was prepared really based on the Capital Markets Master Plan and really trying to come up with some practical, easy wins. We were trying to identify low-hanging fruit where we possibly could. That paper was published in March 2015, and some of the points I'll be touching on really come from that paper. So what I was planning to do was, after a few minutes of looking at some sort of comparative numbers as to where Nigeria fits in the overall global environment on the capital market side of things, I was going to touch on just a couple of the points which had come out of the study and the work done by the solicitors group. But before going on to that, I have to say that I have to confess that I've been, despite the last speaker's slightly pessimistic outlook, I must say I've been extremely encouraged by what I've been hearing for the last day and a half. There's a real enthusiasm in the room, and I think collectively we are all pushing at an open door here. And I think, just really to borrow, I hope it's not trademarked and I can get into problems, but to borrow the Nike slogan, it's sort of time just to do it, right? So, these are a selection of slides which I've extracted from a paper prepared by IOSCO and published in September last year. It's really focused on corporate bonds, but that really is one of the growth areas alongside the equity capital markets, providing capital to corporates, providing debt capital to corporates and new startups is one of the real ways in which the capital markets can feed growth into in an economy. And I guess it's perhaps worth just touching on why is that important. And we've had this mentioned off and on during the last day and a half around the role which the capital markets play. And perhaps I'd even differ with the Bismarck and the previous thing about we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for low oil prices. Actually, I think developing capital markets is in and of itself a requirement of all economies. There have been plenty of studies around the resilience of emerging markets who had access to domestic capital markets. It does help resilience when there are external shocks. But more importantly, and it's a horrible word, but the degree of financialization of an economy is a real indicator of the prosperity of an economy and the health of that economy. Now, there's obviously arguments around chicken and egg, but the extent to which one can be assisting the development of the financialization in an economy, then that has to be a good thing. So what is the slide telling us? It's telling us that the size of the international corporate bond market in Nigeria is fairly small. No big deal. When I'm talking about corporate bonds, international corporate bonds, what we're really referring to here are dollar bonds primarily. And then the similar sort of story when we look at the depth of the capital markets, the international corporate bond market. Very relatively small percentage of the GDP is made up or funded via the corporate debt market. Then let's just have a quick look at the domestic corporate bond market, and there similar sort of story about the relative small size of that market, and that story is borne out again when we look at the depth of that domestic bond market. And I think it's perhaps worth just, almost as an aside, just looking back at China. And if you look at the depth of that international bond market in China, you'll see just how small a percentage of its GDP really is. And then if you look at the size of that market in the renminbi or yuan market. It's an enormous domestic market, and as a percentage of the depth, the percentage of GDP, its depth, it has a really deep market, as does South Korea. And this is why many commentators are perhaps not quite so concerned about the downturn in China. With a huge domestic bond market and huge domestic funding and very low percentage of international debt, they're in a much, much stronger position. So what does this final slide or final comparative slide tell us? Well, to my mind, that just screams opportunity. You could look at this and get depressed, but actually you can look at it also and just say, hey, that's a fantastic growth story from here, right? This slide is extracted from a paper which is prepared fairly regularly by a company called ZYN, and they poll market participants around the world around what they think or how they would rate one financial center against another. And I think it's instructive for this session, and really it's just talking about the factors which international participants look at a currency, look at a financial center, and what is important. And obviously wearing my wearing a Roll UK hat, the rule of law is up there, top left, alongside political stability. And we've heard speakers in the last day and a half reiterate this. It's not just the rule of law, it's also not just the laws, it's also the implementation of those laws and enforcement. And I can't help but just stay on that one slide and just reflect on some of the discussions yesterday, and with my colleague Bridget as well was mentioning, around project bonds. We actually launched a bond for Thames Tideway yesterday, and I can tell you that it's a very, very long and difficult process to get project bonds to market, even in developed economies, even with what you would hopefully call the rule of law with a degree of political stability. It's not the easiest of types of funding to arrange through the capital markets. Turning perhaps to more concrete things which may assist in the development of the efficiency of the Nigerian capital markets. I think this has been touched on frequently in the presentations which have been made and in the panel discussions over the last day and a half. But I just can't help but overemphasize the importance of transparency. I think one of the very first speakers talked about trust, and it was just mentioned again, trust. How do you regain trust? Well, one of the ways that you can regain trust if you're regulators and legislatures is ensuring there is full transparency. And what does that mean? That means that there is regular reporting requirements imposed on listed equity, companies with listed equity or listed debt. And there's an obligation to disclose, as soon as reasonably practical, any kind of information which might be material to the price of the relevant securities. And then you have a regime which is we see in North America and we see in Europe, where you have a long history of rigorous enforcement of these rules. You have a long history of fines, censure, and where required, delisting. That enforcement of transparency rules embeds a culture of full disclosure. It means it's not just a club of investors who trade on inside information, and hopefully goes some way to rebuilding trust in the capital markets. The other key feature, I think, and I'm not sure whether it actually has happened yet or whether it's part of the development plan, but one of the great strengths of both the North American and European transparency systems is the availability of information online. The SEC